I so kind of fell into my career in violence against women. In some respects, I fell into it, and in some respect, I was very determined. I decided very young that I was going to be a prosecutor, and I was going to focus on violence against women. And when I went to the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, after, I have my law degree, and I realized they have no specialized prosecutors. They have no specialized prosecutors for domestic violence, no specialized prosecutors for sexual assault, and when you are just starting out as a prosecutor, you can choose. Now, do you want to, here is this tiny little driving while intoxicated case. It's a small file where he failed to maintain a single lane. You can go to trial on that and be done tomorrow. Or let me go get my carload of domestic violence case or my carload of documents on a terrible sexual assault, and you'll be in trial for 2 weeks. And which one do you think the judge of Dallas County wants to do? Well, I got a golf game at 3. And so it was very frustrating for prosecutors. It was really hard to get those really hard cases filed. And so in 1994, I convinced the district attorney to let me create a violence against women unit. And they agreed to do that. And it consisted of me and one investigator. And and everybody thought that I had lost my mind. They thought that I had come undone. And they said, boy, you really must have made the DA mad. And I said, no, this is really what I want to do. Because this was, I felt like a lot of prosecutors went to law school because they wanted to prosecute murder cases. These were the ones that were in the newspaper, and these were the ones that were on the news, and these were the big cases. But I thought, it's great if you can prosecute a murder case, but it is even better if you can prevent a murder case. And that is done by aggressively prosecuting underlying domestic violence cases, sexual assault cases, stalking cases, getting protective orders for victims, and all the other things that are not necessarily as glamorous. And so I decided that we would do this, and it turned out to be wonderful. For 13 years, I specialized in trying cases that focused on violence against women. We did have some male victims of domestic violence, male victims of sexual assault, but the vast majority were female. My investigator, who recently passed away, who was my investigator for 15 years, Steve Dreamboy Story, he used to always say, and he is actually from, I was going to say he's Arkansas, he's from Alabama, but he would always say that if there were as many male victims of domestic violence as there are female victims of domestic violence, there would be a battered men's shelter on every corner with valet parking in the front and a golf course out back. And I think that there's something to be said for that. And so one of the things that we tried to do in Dallas was to, you cannot prosecute a case. You're never going to prosecute a case of domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking unless you provide the underlying services to the victim of that crime. We cannot look just at criminal justice as the answer to the problem because you're not going to find it there. We have got to focus on the underlying services that victims need. And let me tell you, the victims will not be able to come down and face their abuser, because they have to do it. You can't do it with a written statement. You can't do it on a video. You can't do it behind a closed door. They have to be able to come down and look at that abuser, that person who raped them, that person who abused them, and testify against them. And they are not going to be able to do that unless we provide them the services to heal. So we cannot look just at law enforcement. It is very important that victims of sexual assault, for example, specifically receive a forensic exam by a competent professional. We didn't have a specialized place in Dallas. They used the intern in the OBGYN to come and do the sexual assault exams. And I nearly got into a screaming argument with one doctor who wouldn't testify to the injuries on her body because he said, well, that's not my area. I just do the gynecological stuff. So the fact that she had petechiae in her eye, which is when the blood vessels burst in your eye when you have been strangled, he wouldn't testify to that, which would not corroborate what the victim had said, which was that he had strangled her. At that point, we said we have got to have specialized sexual assault forensic exams. The other thing that is, this is going on right now, get your pens out, because right now there is a new law that every state who gets money from the Office on Violence Against Women, which every state does, you know, you have to make sure that every victim of sexual assault receives a free exam. In Dallas, up until a few years ago, when you went to get your sexual assault exam and you received your treatment for any possible STDs and you got your rape kit and the doctor's time, you got a bill for $421 2 weeks later. And even if, yes, if you fought and scratched, you could get the Crime Victims Compensation Fund to pay for that, but is that really what you want to do? It needs to be provided free of charge right then. And also, here's the second part of that rule, is that it has to be provided to victims even if they are not willing to cooperate with police at that time. Because let me tell you, you have 72 hours. You have 72 hours to get that rape exam done so that you can collect all of the scientific evidence. And so if you tell her, I'm not going to do the exam unless you're willing to cooperate, and if she, let me tell you, she or he is not physically or mentally able to make that determination many times. Now, some women can. I had a rape victim who was amazing. She, after the man had forced himself on her, he forced her to perform oral sex, and he went to the bathroom, and she got up out of that bed, and she went to the closet where she kept plastic bags, and she spit into the plastic bag, and she zipped it up, and she gave it to the police. He is making some new friends and learning some new dance steps down at the Texas Department of Corrections. But many women, they cannot possibly do that. You need to provide them the medical exam that they need right then. And then later, if she decides, you know what, I've been in counseling, I've been seeing people that are being helped by Helen Jane, and I can do this, then you'll have the evidence. But if you don't get it at the time, you won't have it. You got to get it while the getting's good. The other thing that many of my domestic violence folks need, and this is something that's really a big issue right now, when you have the Office on Violence Against Women, we have $400 million, and that money can be spent on prosecutors and law enforcement, shelters and counselors, but only a small portion can be spent on civil legal assistance. If a woman cannot get a divorce from her husband, she is never going to be able to permanently escape that abuse. And yet, only a small portion of money can be used for civil legal assistance. And let me tell you, my victims, you bet, they were afraid of being homeless if they left their abuser. They were afraid of being thrown into poverty because they haven't had a job in 10 years and they didn't think they could get one. And even if they did, it didn't have health care and it wouldn't pay for the daycare. But the thing that they fear more than anything else is losing their children. And if they do not have access to civil legal assistance, that is exactly what will happen. And many people think, oh, that couldn't possibly happen. Let me tell you that if you go to a judge and you have the abuser who has a job and he sings in the church choir and his neighbors like him and he can afford the house and he wants the kids because he wants her to stay, and so he says he wants the kids, and you have her and she's staying in a shelter, and so therefore the judge classifies her as homeless. She has no job. She doesn't really have job prospects, but she's doing what she can. She can't afford the house. She can't afford to keep the kids in the place where, you bet you that there are judges who will absolutely give those kiddos to the abuser. And unless we have civil legal assistance for those victims, they will lose their kids. And if they think they will lose their kids, they will not leave. They will stay and they will suffer the abuse in silence. We have got to make sure that we are providing all the services that a victim of domestic violence and sexual assault needs. When I went to the Office on Violence Against Women, I really believed strongly that when we passed the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, we began making great strides in the area of domestic violence. We had created a lot of safety nets. We had not done as well by sexual assault victims. Let me tell you, we really didn't. And that was something, and Helen Jane was kind to mention it, but it was a real passion of mine to focus more on sexual assault services. And we did manage to launch a sexual assault services program while I was there. And we are starting a big pilot project which is going to focus on providing sexual assault services to victims in rural areas, which are so often, if you are lucky enough to have services at all, it's probably because you are near a larger area. Our sisters, our mothers and daughters and sisters and friends who are in the rural areas are very likely not to have access to services. So this program, I mean, we need to do it everywhere, but if I had to pick one place to start, we started with the rural areas. And I think that it's going to make a real difference for these victims, and I hope that it will continue. I'll tell you another big thing that's going on right now is whether or not when a victim is a victim of sexual assault and she goes to the clinic to receive her forensic exam, and they're going to take the swabs and they're going to collect evidence, and they're going to give her medicine to try to ward off any sexually transmitted diseases. And it's a very big issue right now, and you need to know about it. It's maybe I'm not supposed to go into controversial stuff, but I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we should talk about at a lunch, is whether she should have access to emergency contraception. Very big deal. Big fight in the halls of the Department of Justice and the Health and Human Services. So you need to know about it in case you have a strong opinion about that, as I did and got into lots of fights. But I think it's very important that we look at the things that we want our victims of sexual assault to receive. Now that I am at Vital Voices, I was so fortunate. You know, I'll tell you, I love Texas. And I had every intention, after I had served at the Department of Justice, my plan was to get my two little pumpkins, ages 6 and 8, and hightail it right back to Dallas, where my husband had kept his law practice. And I was going to go back and swim at the pool in the summer and go right back and eat Mexican food with my good girlfriends every Friday night. And I would absolutely have done that had I not had an amazing opportunity to join Vital Voices Global Partnership, which is a nonprofit organization. We focus, it's only international, and we work with women who are leaders in their communities. And our motto is, if you invest in women, you will change the world. And I just couldn't, it made me want to get up in the morning. And I swear I wake up, even now I wake up and I think, jackpot, jackpot. And it made me stay in DC, even though I hate the food. But I love working at this organization. And I have had a chance to work on the issue of violence against women at the international level now. And there are some things, you know, it's funny, I've been to shelters for sexual assault victims and victims of domestic violence all over the world. And it is amazing. So many things are very, very similar. They are struggling for funding. They are struggling to get enough money to provide their core services. And that is certainly very similar. But there are some issues going on in our world that are really very different than what we deal with here in the United States. And I'm going to mention them just so that you know that they're out there. You know, Martin Luther King said, if injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And let me tell you, folks, there is some serious injustice going on for our sisters in other parts of the world. One of those big problems is the issue of forced marriage. It's very difficult for us to deal with this because, in case you didn't know this already, when you go to other countries and say, oh, let me tell you how the Americans do that, that is not always met with a great deal of enthusiasm. That may or may not be well received. And so, especially with the issue of forced marriages, I went to a shelter in Africa where a wonderful woman named Sister Beatrice in Benin, Africa, on the western coast of Africa, she has a shelter. She originally was going to take in just orphaned girls, but she found out that the greatest need was for women, young girls between the ages of 7 and 21 who had been forced into abusive marriages by their parents. These girls are forced into the marriage. They have no say in the matter. The family receives a dowry for that, and then they are sent to live with this very often older man who is very violent, has other wives, and they are terrible victims of sexual abuse and and assaults, and she can't go anywhere. Like a domestic violence victim here can say, well, I'm going to go home, and most of the time the family says, it's about time, I'll leave the light on for you. They don't leave the light on. They have accepted the dowry. They have slaughtered the goat. We can't take you back. You've got to stay. You have to stay. You can't come home. And she can't stay there. She can't go home. She is 15 years old in a village in Africa. Where is she going to go? She's going to go to Sister Beatrice, if you're lucky to live outside of Cotonou. You can't get to Sister Beatrice's shelter except by going on this bumpy road in a car. Then you have to get in the canoe and row because it's a village on stilts. And then if you go during the dry season, like me, you can't get all the way up to the shelter, so they bring out the church pews so that you cannot fall into the water because there's no plumbing and it is full of parasites. And so I am walking on the church pews thinking, don't fall, don't fall, don't fall, to go and see the shelter. It is amazing what she is doing. She has 72 women in 2 rooms. And yet it is hard because so much of this is based on culture and religion. And so it is hard if you come in and you say, this is awful. Well, you're not culturally sensitive. Well, and if you go in and say, I think it's a good practice, but could we just work on the parameters? Well, that's not going to be enough. It is really tricky, folks. It's tricky. And we're also seeing a similar thing. In addition to the forced marriages, this is going on in many of the Muslim countries. It's going on in many of the African countries. The other thing that we are seeing, which is a really it is new. It's new to us, and they believe that the first time that this was used was in the Bosnia and Serbian conflict, when you often hear about conflict zones and the sexual assaults that go on in conflict areas. Many people in America think that, well, this is going on as a crime of opportunity. The village men have gone to fight, the women and children are left, the conquering army comes in, they're away from home, here are all these women, and so they rape them as a crime just because they can. And it's a crime of opportunity. No, it is not a crime of opportunity. It is part of a military tactic. It is so much a part of the military tactic, and it's recognized now that the United Nations Security Council, which only deals with military global issues, has agreed last summer in New York that this is such a military tactic that sexual violence is something that should be considered by the Security Council. And this is going on extremely badly in the Congo. I met with women just 2 weeks ago where the armies will specifically come in. They will rape the women. They will frequently kill their children, but they do not kill the women because they want the women to go back to the village and tell everybody what has happened to them so that the village will flee, and then that's easy to conquer. You just move right in. Or they won't fight. They'll just do what they say. It's evil and it's brilliant. And it's a thing that's just going on now. So when you hear about this, I want you to keep in mind, this is not a crime of opportunity. This is a military strategy, and we as a world need to think about this and work on this because our sisters in other countries are really struggling. The other issue that I want to mention specifically regarding the international front is the issue of human trafficking. I was at a meeting the other day and I said, I'm from Texas, and people in Texas think that human trafficking is when you pay a coyote to bring you over the border as an illegal immigrant. That is not. That's smuggling, maybe. That's not human. Human trafficking is when a person is forced to work for the profit and somebody else who owns you profits from that. And so it's actually a very unfortunate term because it doesn't at all describe what it is. Modern day slavery is a much more descriptive way. And what's going on? More than half of victims of human trafficking, modern day slavery, are women. Almost 80% by some statistics. And half of those are under the age of 18. Of those women who are victims of modern day slavery, many of them are in countries like India, they are in countries like Southeast Asia or Latin America, and they are working for nothing in garment factories. They are working slave labor, and they owe a debt, and so they're a bonded servant. But even more likely than that, they are victims of sexual human trafficking. They are forced into the brothels. They are forced into brothels in Europe and in America and in Cambodia and Thailand and China. And this is a terrible, we have got to do something about this. This is a terrible fate, and we need to be careful about what we do. We need to be careful. And what we have to decide, though, is, okay, it's going on in Cambodia. So do you cut off funding for Cambodia because we know that they have this human trafficking problem? But if you cut off the funding, you make the poverty worse. And if you make the poverty worse, more women end up trafficked. So I think that we need to be more strategic about what we do and give the money, but don't give it to the government. Give it to the NGOs. So don't, continue to give them aid, but do it in a more strategic fashion. I really think that we as Americans need to recognize that there are terrible things going on here that we can focus on, but we need to be mindful of what, the world is getting smaller and smaller, and we need to be able to know and to acknowledge what's going on in other places. One of my favorite quotes is by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, when he said that the ultimate tragedy of our time is not the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. And I live my life not being silent. And I urge you all not to be silent about these issues. The fact that you are even here today, I can tell I'm in a room of boisterous people, and I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for not being silent about these issues, because it is affecting all of us. It's absolutely affecting all of us, and it can stop, but we have to really work together and be loud about making it stop. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have at all about these topics.
We do have time for some questions. So if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Here you go.
Yes, you mentioned that emergency contraception after sexual assault is an issue. If the morning after pill, isn't that available over the counter these days? How is that halting people from getting this?
The issue with the emergency contraception, you're correct, it is available, but we're talking about whether or not the nurse examiner, the sexual assault nurse examiner, will offer it to them right then and there. And there is absolutely a large faction that does not want the sexual assault nurse examiner to offer them that pill or to discuss that pill with the victims, particularly those that are receiving government funding for their sexual assault services. And I think that that is where the real issue comes in, is whether it's going to be done by these, if you're receiving grant funding, and whether it can be discussed and whether it can be provided with grant funding as well. That's a great question, though. Thank you.
One of the things you didn't mention in the overseas, what about genital mutilation? Is that still as big a problem? Is it decreasing, increasing?
That's a great question, and it gives, her question is regarding female genital mutilation. We do work on that at Vital Voices as well. What we are seeing with the issue of female genital mutilation, and you've seen this in other areas, but this is a perfect example. Many countries, many in large part due to pressure and shame, have actually implemented laws that prohibit it. But those laws are absolutely not being implemented. It is one of those situations where there is a huge gap between what the law says and what is actually going on. My opinion is that we are making great strides in sort of shaming countries into creating laws against this. What we now need to do is to work on the harder task of implementing those laws and actually changing the practices, which are often going on in very remote villages. They are remote from us, and they're even remote from their own capitals. So I absolutely see it going on. It's a little bit less. The laws have changed, and that is a good first step. Now we need to work on implementation. Thank you.
Allie? We'll get you next.
Hi, my name is Allie Turo. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Thank you so much for coming. Your
my
passion
pleasure.
about these issues is really motivating. It seems like Vital Voices does a lot of work to empower women around the world. Does the organization have any initiatives to engage men in the process so that these women are entering communities where they're supported and welcomed by the male community as well?
That is a great question. This is absolutely an issue. Most recently, Vital Voices had our Global Leadership Awards, and one of our speakers, one of our presenters was Ben Affleck, who gave an impassioned and really very compelling argument that as long as this is only a women's issue, it will always be a women's issue. And the need to get wonderful, strong men involved. And in fact, I should have commented on how wonderful it is. I often give presentations when there's not a single man in the room. And I am loving the fact that there are wonderful, strong men who can serve as examples. And we absolutely need to bring more men to this issue. And I really don't think that we will overcome the problem until we are more evenly divided in our advocates. That's a great question.
We'll go back here first.
I'd like to applaud your energy and enthusiasm too. It's quite catching. You know, a question, I'm curious what you think about the U.S. and CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Yes, a quite loaded question.
As long as we're going into controversial topics. Okay.
Well, actually, and to follow up on that, because there's a special rapporteur on health, and Ann Grover, who started in August of 2008, and his primary interest is actually in looking at violence against women. So I don't know if you've partnered with him or not, but this is something he's very interested in addressing.
What she has mentioned is CEDAW, which is I'll probably get the acronym wrong, Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. And the United States is one of the few people, one of the few countries who did not ratify and sign on to CEDAW. And the real reason, because listen, we'll be blunt and upfront. They won't probably have me back, but you asked the question, not me. So the real reason they didn't sign it on is because of the real divisiveness of the reproductive issue here in the United States. And that is what prevented the U.S. from signing on to CEDAW. And there is much talk now that with the Senate changing and with the administration changing, maybe the United States will sign on to CEDAW. What I will tell you, I'm not going to go into the divisiveness. That is why it didn't pass. It's important for you to know that. But the vast, vast, vast majority of CEDAW has nothing to do with that. It is about things that we would all agree on. And I'll tell you that this is actually hits a personal front with me because I went to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, in Vienna, for the Violence Against Women thematic debate and resolution, and I represented the U.S. And I will tell you, it was a freaking embarrassment. When I am siding with freaking, I think that's in Black's Law Dictionary. I'm pretty sure. Freaking, yeah. So we're talking about in these, when you go to these resolutions, everybody wants to emphasize this treaty or applaud that resolution or whatever. And we have Canada, Mexico, Colombia, all of Europe, most of Latin America, all of Asia, China, Japan, who want to say, and we want to recognize CEDAW. And over here, we have the United States and Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Oman. Okay, I was mortified. I don't have to know much, but I tell you, I'm on the wrong side. Because, and I will say that, and it was all because of a very small portion of the convention. The most of the convention, all Americans were in agreement on. And so it is a shame that they're wanting to cite the wonderful parts of CEDAW, but it was really embarrassing. And the other people who I'm on their side on all the other issues against these people, and I suddenly find myself on the side of some of these much more restrictive countries. So it's very interesting that you should bring that up because I did have that. There is a movement right now to have CEDAW ratified in the Senate, and I suspect that it will go through. And also the all forms of child labor, which has also been a sticking point as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw. I will say one quick little tidbit about my UN experience, and this is for your daughter Anne Ream would love this because you read a poem in the press conference regarding what I wore. Many sexual assault victims are asked, well, what were you wearing? And really, they don't mean it. I don't think that people mean it as a way to criticize them, but they mean it as a way to ensure that it couldn't happen to them. It's really not meant to blame you. I'm really just trying to insulate myself. And I will tell you that the distinguished delegate from Iraq, whose side I was on with regard to CDOS, his contribution to the resolution on violence against women was emphasizing the role of chastity and modesty in dress in the prevention of violence against women. And he could not understand why I was about to twist off and come undone, that we could not put, he was like, no, well, this, and he had orders from Tehran, he had orders from Capitol to include a provision in the resolution about emphasizing the role of chastity and modesty in dress, and that would help in the prevention of violence against women. So that's for her.
Was that for men?
Yeah, really?
Here you go, Judge.
Thanks so much for being here. My name is Vic Fleming, and I'm a judge here locally. I preside over 600 or 700 DWI cases each year, among other things. And as I was thinking about coming to this program today, I happened to see a sign. This is what the sign says, and it's on one of our establishments in Main Street. Ladies' Night, 50 cents, Bud Light. And I wanted to ask, why ladies? Why night? Why Bud Light? And why 50 cents? And every answer that I came up with was corporate sponsorship. It's demeaning to females, and it propagates an activity that results in a lot of day-to-day violence to females. I wondered if you would comment a little bit about the statistics where alcohol plays a role, other substance abuse plays a role, and the way in which corporate sponsors propagate events that lead to that type of sexual violence. And I mean, to me, that's a lot more where the rubber hits the road than going to Iraq or Iran right now. And can only do what we can do here at home. So.
Right, and I'm so glad. I love it when members of the judiciary come to things like this. Please, I think that is wonderful. We have a few really great judges in Dallas and Austin that have made such a difference in prosecuting violence against women cases, and so I love to have members of the judiciary here. And you're absolutely right. Anytime that you see, ladies get in free, ladies' night, the ubiquitous, the wet t-shirt contest, all of this stuff, it is so very demeaning. And he is so right that at the root of all of that is profit. At the root of it all is profit. And in that respect, we are not so different from the sex trafficking in Cambodia, because that too, at the root of that is profit. Young Cambodian women are very profitable for the brothel owners. And it's not that different here. And I do think that we need to be creative at ways. We don't want to inhibit free speech. We don't want to overly regulate our business industry. We love the fact that we have a free market, and so that allows a little bit of flexibility, but there has to be a balance. And I think that the trouble is often in finding the balance. I'll tell you that one thing that we did in Texas, which I think is interesting. I don't know that it will get to the problem, but it at least makes good use of the issue. And that is, we passed in Texas what it's actually called the SOB tax. And it actually stands for sexually oriented business, as opposed to the other SOB, which I can't say in front of my mother. But the SOB tax puts a tax on the head of every person who enters a sexually oriented business. That tax goes into the state's coffers, and it can be used for sexual assault services, because of the very point that you bring up. There is a recognition that when you mix alcohol and sexually oriented businesses, and a lot of, this one is not just to your average bar, but actually to something that would be classified as a sexually oriented business, that it does contribute to the crime of sexual assault. And so it got caught up in a constitutional challenge, because the first they were expecting to make $42 million off of this tax. The first $25 million is going to go to sexual assault services. The over and above that was going to go to general health care for the indigent, and that was the problem. They said there wasn't enough of a nexus between the tax and the indigent health care. But there was enough of a nexus between the tax and sexual assault services. So I anticipate that they will rewrite that legislation so that the full amount goes just to sexual health services. But I think that it is a way, one of the biggest problems that we have in providing services for our victims is a lack of funding, especially in economic times like these. And so that is, I think, I like to see people and states doing creative things to take advantage of there are ills in our society, most of them are here because of good reasons. But it's in that balance, and one way to take advantage of it is to at least try to use it for the sexual assault services that are so desperately needed by our victims.
I'm going to go right here and then to you.
Hi, I love your presentation, and I'm here because I am really screaming for help. I am a Latino victim advocate for the entire state, and I've been working, I can relate to everything you said. I've been working with victims of human trafficking, and they've been sold to their rapists from everywhere. I'm really a Latino advocate, but I have people from, they just hear international, and they say, they send it to Lisette. So really where I need help is, what would be your advice in 3 areas that is a big concern of mine? The first one is all these victims that are these clients that I'm trying to help. Sometimes I feel that I'm giving them false promises, especially under the T visas or the U visas.
Yes.
My 3 promises, the first one is that we go through all the steps and go to the process, or to press charges, and we are almost there. And then I've been told before by prosecutors that we might not want to spend the tax dollars money in somebody that is here undocumented, number 1. Number 2, sometimes they want the victim to go all the way, but when it's time for them to put their signature in the visa certification, nobody wants. And the third one is that there's also a big problem for those that are here documented, or that they have their LPR or their legal status. Some judges are taking away their passports or their documents because they're considered flight risk. So what's your advice to kind of like tackle all those areas? Because I have a big mouth and I get in trouble a lot, but I also need to continue working with them on a daily basis. But I have close to 180 clients in 2 years, and none one, but my victim of human trafficking have gotten a visa. Everybody else is still waiting.
What she's talking about, for those who didn't hear, in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, it has been reauthorized in 2003 and most recently in 2008. There's a thing called a T visa, and you would think that T stands for trafficking, but it actually stands for the subsection in the Trafficking Act, typical lawyers. And it says that if you are a victim of trafficking, you are here in the U.S., you're being forced to work, you have no control over what you do, all of the money that you make is going to the person above you. If you are a victim of trafficking, then you can qualify for a T visa, because many victims of trafficking cannot go back home. They will be put in grave danger, and many times their families will be put in grave danger too. And because traffickers are like the new organized crime people. These are some scary folks. These are really scary folks. And so the point was to kind of do for trafficking victims what the U visa did for domestic violence victims. If you are a victim of domestic violence, you don't have to stay with your abuser just because he's the only reason you can stay legally in the country. They didn't want that to be. So they say you can leave him and you can just stay in your own right. So it's similar to that. The issue that she refers to is that in order to be able to get a T visa, the victim of trafficking, the immigrant, has to cooperate with law enforcement. And the problem with that is that it's very unclear of how much cooperation is needed. But the law enforcement, the FBI, the U.S. attorneys, the prosecutors, they can refuse to sign the T visa because they can say, I don't want to sign it yet. And the U visa as well. And so she's saying that she has trafficking victims who, or other domestic violence victims who are staying and they're cooperating and they're doing everything, but they can't get these T visas signed, and they just hold it kind of over their head and continue to have them do more and more. And that's actually something that a lot of the trafficking groups are working on. And there is an interest in trying to not take away the requirement. And as a prosecutor, I think that they need to be cooperative, because if they don't, the trafficker will continue to get more and more and more victims. And there are certainly many advocates that say they are for delinking. There should be no requirement to cooperate. You should get the T visa even if you don't. I think you're going to have to cooperate. But I think that what we need to do is just define more clearly how much cooperation is necessary. And at some point, there is a default that you have done enough. Because as you guys know, and I know my friend the judge knows, things can go on, and we don't have any control over it a lot of times. Cases can take a long time to try. And it is at some point, these people are just being yanked around, and we need to just more clearly define what is sufficient cooperation. And that's what some of the advocacy groups and Vital Voices is involved in, that is trying to be, again, I feel like we need to find, the key is moderation. The key is moderation, and it's just finding where is the best place to land. But it is true that our victims from other countries do have they have language barriers, they have cultural barriers. There's actually a new program at the Office on Violence Against Women that is specifically for agencies that are serving culturally and linguistically specific populations. And so you might ought to look at that on the website to see if there might be some funding for you.
Right there.
About 2 years ago in DC, there were a few newspaper articles where several college students had come in to the emergency room claiming sexual assault, and they were turned away because they appeared to be intoxicated, and the doctors were afraid to perform the rape kit for fear that they couldn't legally consent in an intoxicated state. And I've always wondered if that is a widespread problem, especially on college campuses, and if you know if there's any work being done on that legal issue, because it seems like something that could legally be handled and avoid that problem altogether.
That, I did not know of that. I don't remember that specific incident. I can tell you that I do not think that that is I think it is a widespread problem that people are not receiving the forensic sexual assault examinations. And I think that a lot of times there is a desire by local people to not provide those services. I have not heard of the specific reason to not provide them as being an inability to consent. That's a new one on me. But I will tell you that many, many victims of crimes, whether it's a sexual assault, a battery, robbery, many, many victims are intoxicated at the time that they give their report and at the time that they seek assistance, and I have never heard that as a reason to deny treatment. And so I think and I hope that that is a red herring, but I will be on the lookout for it. Georgetown, a fine institute, yes. Well, and I wonder if there was I wonder if that was a ruse, if there was some other reason that they were not wanting to do that sexual assault exam, and that was a reason that they came up with to give. I really don't know. I've never heard that before, and it is extremely common for victims of all sorts of crimes to be under the influence of some type of something at the time that they make their report or receive their treatment. That is very common. So I wouldn't think that that's going to be too widespread, but that is distressing to hear about it even in one-time situation.
We have time for 2 more questions. Tezra and Emily.
Thank you. Could you just make a few comments on gender-based violence and HIV transmission? Because you have not talked about it. What can be done about it, especially in third world countries where women are faced with violence, where conflicts are, and where they don't even have any legal aid? Could you please?
Yes, if I understand, she's wanting me to make a comment on the correlation between domestic violence and HIV, particularly as it relates to third world countries. This is actually a very big problem. This certainly, what she's talking about is it happens here too. Many of my domestic violence victims, they are living with their abuser. They're doing everything they can to kind of keep things low, to not cause a huge breakout, and therefore, many of them have to submit to him in whatever way he requires. The fortunate thing about here is that it is more common for people here to know whether they're HIV positive or not. In Africa and in other developing countries, Latin America, they have no tests. You would have no idea if your partner has HIV. You may or may not know whether they have been engaging in risky behavior, but the problem is that you are expected to provide sex to your husband whenever he wants it. And even in some areas of the world, it is, most recently in Afghanistan, there's been a big hurrah about this, that you can't even rape your wife. They have to be available. And so you can imagine if you are married to somebody and you fear that he has HIV, or you know that he has HIV, you are in extreme danger of being infected yourself. And there is a lot of time, either because of the relationship, it's a battering relationship, or you are in a society where you have no way to say no. You can't even get a divorce. And there are actually some aid organizations that have been trying to distribute condoms to women who are in areas and villages where HIV is rampant in an effort to allow them to protect themselves. But it's very controversial, not in the sense that they're giving condoms. It's controversial in whether or not it is effective, because if you have a man and you can imagine, and you say, well, I will, but you have to wear this, and he says, no, I'm not going to. And so it is very, very common for victims here in the U.S., but even more so in other parts of the world, to be putting themselves at risk every day, and they have very little way to get out of it. One thing I said is they're trying to do this distribution of condoms, but it has been a hard row to hoe, actually. And I think that the better way is, instead of working on the condom distribution, if that would really work, I would say do it. But the problem is you can't get him to wear it. And so I think the better way is to work to fix the underlying social injustice that causes them to be stuck in that relationship in the first place. I think that probably that's where we need to put our efforts. But that's it's an excellent point that you brought up.
Next question.
You actually just touched upon part of my question. Afghanistan's been in the news recently with the legalization of marital rape.
Yeah.
Based on Islamic law.
Yes.
What strategy can people use to combat sexual violence when it's entrenched within religion and the law?
That is a great question, and I was just bending poor Dean's ear at lunch about almost this very issue. I really think that in order for us to make a difference in other parts of the world, specifically those that are based on Sharia law, specifically those that are Muslim-dominated countries, we need to be smarter about what we're going to do, because the fact is that nobody from America, it doesn't matter that I'm at an NGO now instead of at the U.S. government, you cannot march into Afghanistan and say, I'm an American, and let me tell you how you are wrong and what you should do. That's not going to work. We absolutely need to go in there and work on these things, but it's the way that we do it. And so here are the two things that I think we should focus on, and it's actually a great way to sort of end. One thing is what we do at Vital Voices is we don't march in. We don't have offices in other countries. What we have in Afghanistan, even specifically Afghanistan, are women leaders who are working hard, and they are from the area. They have credibility, they are from the area, and all we're doing is helping them. We are providing them with the connections and the capacity and the credibility so that they can change their own community, because they'll be able to do it and we can't. So that's one thing we need to do, is invest in local people who are doing the right thing. The other thing that I think we need to do, and I'm doing this with Egypt, for example, we need to pick friends in Muslim countries that are moderate and that are doing good work. And Egypt is a good example. The First Lady of Egypt is a woman named Suzanne Mubarak, and she has a wonderful nonprofit organization, Women United for Peace International, something, I forget the name of it, IWP. And I think that what we need to do is we need to make sure that they know that the United States is able to help. And it is much better for someone like the First Lady of Egypt to go to Afghanistan than Cindy Dyer to go to Afghanistan. She's going to be more effective. She is one of them. She too is a Muslim. And so I think that we need to utilize our relationships to better get the end result that we need so that women are safe. And I think that, there is a saying about charity is commendable, but it should not let us forget about the underlying social injustice that makes charity necessary. And I think this is one of those things, we need to throw some money at it, but we need to work to change the underlying injustice that makes the charity and the philanthropy necessary. And I think that we need to be strategic about how we do that, by utilizing our relationships with countries like Egypt and others that are doing a good job or a better job on these issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Cindy a round.